Hello everyone, this is Svidler for Chess24, recording a highlights video for Game 5 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Sergey Karjakin. After two games in which Magnus was very close to winning, was at one point winning in Game 3 and at one point probably winning in Game 4, both ended in a draw, as you probably know. In Game 5, Magnus once again was white, and after a day off, I think a reasonably well needed day off for both players, it was interesting to see what will transpire and how the players will approach it. There was also an obvious question of whether Magnus will continue fighting against the Berlin or will opt for something else. There were suggestions that maybe he will even switch away from 1e4, but that didn't happen. He did play 1e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and in this position he made an early change and played bishop c4 instead of bishop b5, perhaps indicating that the idea he'd shown in Game 3, which was very interesting and did eventually lead to a very exciting game, although lots of pieces were exchanged, but with Magnus that doesn't necessarily mean anything in many cases. But perhaps that idea was only really worth one game, and it remains to be seen whether we will see another Berlin or anti-Berlin in this match with Magnus on the white side. But bishop c4 is a very topical line as well. It's been seen a lot in Grandmaster practice in the past couple of years in particular. And it really gained a lot in popularity when a lot of the participants of the candidates tournament in Moscow played it with white. Sergey Karjakin actually has experience with this line on the white side as well. He won a very important game against David Navarre in the Olympiad in Baku, which was the last tournament he played before the World Championship match. So it cannot have possibly been a huge surprise to him. He's obviously looked at this opening with both colors. And players proceeded to play at a very fast pace up until move 12. Bishop c5, castles, knight f6, d3. I think this is currently maybe the most precise move order with which white approaches this position. Although it's very difficult to say. I think most people bring their own taste to the choice of the first 7 or 8 moves in this position. Castles a4. I think this move order is aimed at the early d7, d5 breaks, but once again, I'm not entirely sure. I can't say I formed a very definitive opinion about the proper move orders here, despite having played this with both white and black over the past half a year or so. d6, c3, a6, and here Magnus played b4, bishop a7, and rook e1, which is a curious move order, and we were just starting to get somewhat excited with Eric about the possibility of black playing knight g4, rook e2, king h8, h3, knight h6, which is a very, well, not very, but reasonably well-known idea in these types of positions. It looks a bit weird, but black is getting ready to play f7, f5 on the next move against more or less anything, and in many positions this is considered to be very interesting and very playable. But then I realized that perhaps the reason Magnus included the moves b4 and bishop a7 is that after knight g4 he can play rook a2, not rook e2. And in the same position, I think the inclusion of rook a2 and the fact that the rook is on e1 makes white's position a lot more coordinated. And probably Magnus was quite happy with such a development. And the fact that Karjakin blitzed out knight e7 without thinking at all, pretty much, I think confirms the fact, the suspicion that both players have actually looked at this move order in their home preparation, and both came to the conclusion that knight g4 is not the way to go here. Knight bd2, knight g6 followed, and this is a very typical way for black to develop. The knight gets transferred from c6 to g6, which is considered to be the best square available to that piece in many of these structures. And in general, these types of positions occur both in the Gioco Piano, as in this game, and in many anti-Berlin positions as well. And black's plan is always very similar. The knight goes to g6 via e7, and then black plays for the c6 and d5 break in the center to gain some space, perhaps initiate some exchanges in the center. And generally these positions are considered to be reasonably safe for black. But Magnus introduced a very fresh idea here, I think, because in general, white very often replies to this by bringing his own knight over to g3, and then black can perhaps play d5, e5, knight d5, followed up by c7, c6. And you get this type of a position, which generally in many cases will be very safe for black. But instead of all this, Magnus was the first to occupy the center by playing d3, d4. Sergey played c6 very quickly. It's worth noting that e4, cd4, d5 was possible even immediately. But after takes, and knight e4, I think black needs to be slightly better developed to enter this position, because bishop g5 becomes a bit of an annoying threat. Black probably wants to play c6 anyway, and therefore playing c6 before engaging in all these possibilities is probably a very worthwhile idea. After d4, c6, white doesn't really have any immediate ways to change the situation in the center, so it's very probable that all of those options will still be available to black on the next move. Magnus played h3. If he really wanted to stop the structures that we've seen later in the game, he could have maybe played bishop b3 in this position to make sure that d6, d5 doesn't hit the bishop on c4. But even h3 was played reasonably quickly, which is not surprising considering that up to knight g6, d4, it was quite clearly still home preparation for the world champion, and c6 is a very natural response to d4. And after h3, Sergey finally couldn't avoid that trade any longer, and he played e takes d4. Black could continue playing the waiting game, but this trade feels very, very natural. C takes d4, and in this position he went for an even more ambitious trade by playing knight takes e4 instead of d5. After d5, e takes d5, c takes d5 is playable, but during our commentary we weren't entirely sure what black is doing after, for instance, bishop d3, knight f4, and bishop b1, with the idea of perhaps playing knight b3, knight c5 next. It doesn't feel like black should be necessarily scared about this position, but it's a playable position with chances for both sides. Once again, after knight takes d5, white could maybe go for some piece activity with something like knight e4, because knight takes before bishop g5 looks quite scary for black. For just one pawn, white develops a lot of activity on the king side, and this does feel like it might give white a very, very strong play on the king side and in the center. Knight takes e4, on the other hand, gives white a choice. A safer opportunity would be to play knight takes e4, d5, bishop d3, d4, bishop takes e4, creating a strong positional threat of d4, d5. And if black plays bishop e6, you play b5 with white, and my original assertion that black is never ever worse in this position was perhaps slightly hasty, and white does retain some pressure, although the position should be reasonably close to equality with precise play. But after some thought, Magnus actually went for a completely different structure. He played bishop takes f7 here, rook takes f7, and knight takes e4. And this is a lot more principled than the line I have just shown, because the structure becomes a lot less symmetrical. Black has currently the advantage of having a pair of bishops against two knights and a bishop, but more importantly, the f-file is now semi-open, and a lot will depend on what is more important. The potential weakness of the black king, which now lacks the pawn on f7 to protect it, or the activity black could maybe generate along the f-file. Sergey quite quickly played d6, d5 here. You could maybe make an argument for playing something like bishop f5, but then white would most probably play d4, d5, ruling out the d5 move for black altogether. Uh, and it's understandable that Sergey wanted to play d5 here because he wants to secure the structure, drive the knight away from the e4 square, stop the d4, d5 ideas, and also the bishop on a7 in many cases will rejoin the action via the b8 square, and will also join in all the potential play black could generate on the king side. In this position, it was perhaps interesting to try knight eg5, and after rook f6 we've had a lot of fun during live commentary trying to figure out if this piece sacrifice is any good. The obvious move knight f8 runs into rook e8, and white actually gives mate on h7 against almost any move here. Therefore black will need to allow queen h7 check, and after that a lot of really weird positions emerge where white doesn't have any immediate fast threats, but on the other hand black also finds it very, very difficult to make any kind of a sensible move, and in this position, for instance, b5 with the idea of bishop a3 check could be very, very strong. But after knight eg5, black probably just plays rook e7, not allowing any of those tactics at all, and that was probably the major reason why knight eg5, after a quite serious amount of time spent thinking, was rejected by Magnus. He played knight c5, which is also, a very natural square for this knight, somewhat reminiscent actually of game 4, in which the pawns on, with colors reversed, the pawn structure for Karjakin on the king side was very similar, and there was also a knight on c4, putting some pressure on these pawns. But here with the f-file open, there is actually a lot of play on the other side of the board, and the game became very, very sharp, very fast. Black played h6, which I think is a very good move, stopping white from ever occupying the g5 square with any of his light pieces. Rook a3 was Magnus's move in reply, which is also very natural. The rook wasn't really doing very much on a1. The bishop on c1 cannot really be developed anywhere at all for the time being, or at least anywhere sensible. And therefore, in order to bring this rook into play, Magnus employs a rook lift, hinting at potential rook a3. Sergey played bishop f5, and this is a very important position, I think, in this game. And during our commentary live, we haven't really spotted this idea, and I still don't know if it's any good. But it has occurred to me that, considering what happened later in the game and considering what white had to contend with, perhaps playing a4, a5 here in this position could have been a good idea. The point of this move is not to stop any immediate counterplay, but as you will see in a moment, it is important in many future variations to rule out the threat of a6, a5, because white is about to destabilize his structure in the center quite severely by playing knight e5 on the next move. I'm not sure if black has a smarter move in this position than queen f6, and then you can play knight e5 de, queen h4, and you get the same position they got in the game, but with a pawn on a5, which I think improves white chances considerably, because in every single variation, I think white benefits from not having to worry about a6, a5, undermining the position of the knight on c5. Perhaps black could look for a better move in this position. Maybe bishop takes c5, d takes c5, bishop e4 can be made to work. But I think white has enough control over his king side here, in particular with the rook coming over to g3, or maybe simply f3 followed by bishop b2, bishop d4, to not really having to worry very much about getting mated on the king side. And if all that is true, and black actually does have to play queen f6, and it would appear to me that this is very likely the case, then including a5 and only playing knight e5 on the next move may have been a decent idea. Instead of this, Magnus played knight e5 straight away, very concrete move, hoping to use the fact that black is currently somewhat unprepared to stop e5, e6 in many positions. And in this position, play actually becomes extremely sharp. Black had two options he had to consider very, very seriously here. a6, a5, and also the move queen h4, which Sergey eventually made after, I think, 25 minutes of deep thought. After a5, white probably plays e6, although maybe an argument can also be made for a move like rook f3 or rook g3. And in many cases we were looking at lines, for instance, after rook g3, black can probably do better. But let's say there was a line like this, rook g3, a takes b4, e6, rook e7, queen d4, and white threatens to follow this up with bishop b2, and this pressure against the g7 pawn in many cases turns out to be extremely dangerous and potentially decisive for white. And a5 was definitely possible, but also very risky. Immediate e6 is very much worth considering here. Rook f3 with the idea of e6 is also a very serious move to think about. And queen h4, I think, was a correct choice by Sergey. Now the pawn on b4 is hanging. Black is ready to connect his rooks by playing either rook e8 or rook f8 next move. And the idea of playing a6, a5 is still very much on the agenda, almost in every single position, which once again returns us to the point that perhaps it was sensible to include a5 somewhat early in the game. Rook f3, the move Magnus made in this position, is almost the only move he could make, because otherwise it was difficult to deal with the combined threats of queen takes b4 and in particular a6, a5. And this, for a while, looked to us whilst we were commentating on the game live with Eric Hansen to be maybe the critical moment of the game, because queen takes b4, bishop a3 followed by a6, we couldn't really make work for black. For instance, queen c4, e6, and if, for instance, rook f6, knight d7, rook e6, rook f5 picks up some material. But after rook f3, black could play bishop g6. This move looks very counterintuitive, because you trade off your rook on f7, which looks like a very decent piece. You know, black was very much hoping for some play along the f file, and also you give white e6 with tempo, and you need to spend all this time just to solve the issue of the threat of e5, e6, and also after rook f3 there is a very serious threat in many cases of just playing rook f4, stabilizing everything along the fourth rank, and then playing e5, e6. But this position after e6, bishop g6 is actually extremely unclear and potentially somewhat dangerous for white even, because the pawn gets quite easily controlled by the bishop on g6 and the rook on e8. The pawn on b4 is hanging, and once again, in many cases, black's next move will be a6, a5. For instance, if white tries to control the damage by playing queen g2, black plays a5, and after knight takes b7, you need to very carefully consider both queen takes b4 and maybe even a takes b4. The position is very sharp, very unclear, and since I'm doing this almost immediately after the game, I still don't really know what the evaluation is. But bishop g6 at the very least was a very serious alternative Sergey could have considered here. But he only had about half an hour, I think, for 21 moves he needed to make after rook f3. And his decision to go for a more practical solution, namely bishop takes c5, bc, rook e8, cannot really be criticized, because it was quite clear that this position will be reasonably easy to navigate with the closed nature of the structure on the board, and the remaining pieces being limited in number, so to speak. Whereas if you play bishop g6 and you aim for this position, it is very likely you will have to take a number of very important, very difficult decisions, and the time constraints could become a very serious factor in the evaluation of this position later in the game. But our initial assessment of this position when it appeared on the board was that white has a bit of a free roll here, so to speak. Because the black structure on the queen side, once again, very reminiscent of game 4, where the pawn on c4 for Magnus was effectively controlling all three of Karjakin's pawns on the queen side. Once again, black structure on the queen side is completely immobile. The pawn on d5 will be blocked by probably the queen or the bishop on d4. And it seemed to us in the studio, and also probably to Magnus to a great degree, that it is only white who can really try and make progress in this position. This slight spoiler alert turned out not to be the case, and the next maybe 15 to 20 moves were perhaps the first sequence in the entire match where you can definitely say that the challenger outplayed the reigning world champion, because by the end of move 40, roles were completely reversed. Rook f4, queen e7, queen d4, rook e f8, the rook returned to f3. I'm not sure if this move was strictly speaking necessary, but it's very likely that the same type of position will occur anyway. Sergey played bishop e4. He could have played bishop e6, but I think he correctly understood that it's important to, if at all possible, force white to play f2, f3, so that the rook lift of the rook to g3 never happens in this game. So f3, bishop f5, king h2, bishop e6, rook e2, queen g6, bishop e3, rook f7. This kind of a setup is, I think, probably the ideal position for black's pieces. And now it's time to sort of take stock. The only way for white to really make any progress is to go for some kind of a plan with g4 and f4. If you start with f4, black will always invariably play h6, h5, and the pawn on g2 will probably never reach g4 in this game, effectively completely stopping white's only plan of making any kind of a progress. Therefore, you need to try and prepare g2, g4 first, and then try and play f4, gain some space. Although, even after that, even if you force, let's say, black to move the queen somewhere else and play g7, g6, black will be very, very passive, but also extremely, extremely solid. So it's not a given that white would have made progress even if he achieved all that. But for the time being, it looks like white is completely safe, and he will be the one trying to maneuver around to improve his position and get somewhere. And if we fast forward somewhat, rook f2, queen b1, rook b2, queen f5. Magnus played a5 here, which is a decision you don't necessarily want to take, because once again, similarly to game 4, we were half seriously discussing with Eric whether in some endgames the only winning chance white will have would be to march the king from h2 towards a5 and b6. But obviously playing a5 puts paid to all that. And just as we were discussing with Eric live on air whether a5 was a bit of a draw offer, although Magnus never really offers draws in positions like this, he always plays on. It was Sergey who actually came up with a plan which changed the state of the game quite drastically. He played king f8. We thought only hinting at the king march towards the queen side, but he was deadly serious about it. Queen c3, king e8, rook b4. Perhaps with the idea of playing rook f4 and taking the rooks off. And once again, we were saying that with only maybe less than 10 minutes left on his clock, and seven moves to the time control, and also considering the fact that the endgame with only the queens and the bishops on is quite probably drawn, we were not really giving the likelihood of Sergey playing g7, g5 here a very high probability, so to speak. That sentence probably didn't come out properly English, but I apologize, it's somewhat late at night. But Sergey did blitz out g7, g5 here, which I think threw Magnus a little bit. And as a matter of fact, it was perhaps wise for Magnus here to take the forced draw he could take immediately here. He could play queen b2, using the fact that the king is not on c8 yet. If you play bishop c8 here for black, I think by playing e6 straight away, and after queen takes e6, simply playing something like bishop f2, white would get a very, very nice position where the king is, with the pawn on g5 and white controlling the long diagonal, the king probably will not really feel safe anywhere on the board. Although, now that I look at this position with a slightly saner eyes, queen f6 probably secures black's position well enough to not have to worry about anything. And if black wants to continue running with the king toward the c8 square, you can play f3, f4. Now b7 is actually hanging, and there is also a threat if, for instance, black plays king c8 of taking on g5 and playing rook g4. And or possibly maybe even playing g4 here, queen d3, rook b3, and following it up with f5. I'm not entirely sure if this works. Once again, I haven't really checked any of this immediately after the broadcast. But it seems like the safest bet for black in this position would be to play g5, g4, which already would not have been such a trivial decision considering how short on time Sergey would have been at this point. And after rook b7, rook takes b7, queen takes b7, and queen e4, it would appear that white has nothing better than some kind of a perpetual, because both g3 check and g takes h3, all of these moves represent very, very serious threats. So this would probably mean the game ends in some kind of a forced draw before even the first time control. Instead of that, Magnus played rook b2, king g8, and rook f2. And this still is fine for white, I think. But after king c8, queen d4, queen g6, it does feel that, with the king safely on c8 and the pawn already on g5, it is black who has potential for some improvement on the king side. There is, in some positions, a plan of simply going h5 and g4. There is also maybe a slightly awkward idea of playing queen g7. Sorry about all the arrows. Queen g7 followed by rook f5 to put some pressure on the e5 pawn. But nonetheless, it was a very striking, I think, decision to play g4 and move 38. I think Magnus was still under the impression that in this position he is running zero risks and can still do whatever he pleases. That really is no longer true, because the way his pieces are positioned and the way the black pieces are currently positioned after h5, there is very, very serious and real danger of black assuming control of the h-file. Queen d2, rook g7, and here Magnus played king g3, which probably is not the most precise move, but I think from a human viewpoint this position is already somewhat unpleasant for white. It requires, I think, very precise play not to allow some kind of a breakthrough. I'm not even sure queen d2 is such a great idea, because as you will see very soon, leaving the blockading square on d4 can lead to additional troubles for white. But something probably needs to be done with the threat of simply rook h7 followed by takes and queen h6. So it's hard to criticize Magnus for trying to keep the black heavy pieces tied down to the defense of the g5 pawn. Rook g7, king g3, rook g8, which is also a very understandable decision, even if objectively the move queen h6 immediately was probably even stronger. Making a move like rook g8 to reach the first time control cannot really be faulted by Sergey. It's very natural not to want to commit to anything decisive on move 40, because your position, rook g8 doesn't really spoil anything, and re-evaluating move 41 is definitely a sensible plan. Magnus realized that queen h6 will be a very strong threat even on move 41 here, and played king g2. But here, after takes, his position is still actually very dangerous. For instance, black could even go for something reasonably prosaic here and play queen h6, king g1, which was probably his plan, and now simply queen h3, stopping the rook from coming to h2, because the pawn on f3 will be hanging. And now black has a very, very strong threat of rook h8, rook h2, and queen g3 check, which if white does absolutely nothing, will just win on the spot. White can try maybe playing queen e2, so that in this position, queen g3, rook g2, at least the f3 pawn is not hanging. Black can take on e5 here, so I'm not sure if this is so great for white, to be honest. But queen h6, queen h3, as mentioned, would have created very, very serious problems for white here. But Sergey, quite understandably, went for a very thematic idea in these types of positions. He played d5, d4, which it's a pawn sacrifice, but it makes his bishop on e6 join the attack. So it's a very understandable and a very strong move. I'm not sure if it's stronger or weaker than queen h6 or queen h3, but it's a move you can't fault, even if objectively other moves are stronger, because in terms of, conceptually, this is definitely a very strong idea and a very good one. In this position, Magnus had obviously a choice of two captures on d4, and after some thought, he took with the queen, although it probably was safer to take with the bishop, and if black plays something like rook h8, you can maybe make an argument for king g1 anyway. Queen b1, rook f1, rook h1 doesn't really lead anywhere, because in this position white takes on g5 and makes a draw. And if black plays bishop d5, perhaps white can also play rook h2 here. Perhaps e6 is a move. There is a number of options available to white here. And queen takes d4 allows a lot of other very, very dangerous ideas for white. So during the live show, we were preferring bishop takes d4 to queen takes d4, but I'm pretty sure that none of those two moves actually equalize for white, and it's a question of which one gave white better holding chances. Once again, I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that is. Queen takes d4 makes sense because you want to play queen e4 next move. Psychologically, it feels like you are improving the prospects of your pieces more than you do when you're taking with the bishop. Because if you take with the bishop, you don't really have any active ideas for the next move. After, let's say, rook h8, there is no way to stop black invading along the h file, at least not immediately. Maybe you can play king g3 here, but after bishop takes d4, if black doesn't want to allow king g3, he can start with queen h6 or queen h7. Both of those moves make sense. Probably queen. I mean, you can find positives for both of those, because queen h7 preserves the idea of queen b1 check in some positions, whereas if you play queen h6, the pawn on g5 will not be hanging after rook h8. So both make sense to me, but once again, precise analysis needs to be done to determine which one of the two is stronger. After queen takes d4, we come to probably the last really big decision of the game. I think at this point Sergey had around 35 minutes left, maybe even 40, and the position definitely deserved some very, very serious consideration, because his play between moves, let's say 30 and 42, I think was exemplary, and he had a very, very decent chance of posing serious problems to Magnus here if he played precisely. And the move he made, bishop d5, is once again hard to criticize, because that was sort of the point of d5, d4. You activate this bishop, you keep all of your options open on the king side, and you also stop the move queen e4, which I mentioned as the one source of counterplay for white. But rook h8 instead, I think, was very, very dangerous for white. I'm pretty sure that both players felt that white holds after queen e4. Our very, very brief check with the machine during the live show indicated that queen c3 maybe is a stronger move, but I think it's very, very difficult to play like that for a human player, because this move doesn't seem to create any threats. It doesn't seem to take too many important squares even under control, and black is allowed to play something like queen h7, king f1, queen h1 check, and king e2. And this looks frankly positively scary for white. But maybe the position is not that bad. But once again, I feel that queen e4 was the reason that the players felt white is fine here. Queen h6, king f1, queen h1 check, king e2. And here there are two very obvious moves black can try. One is rook d8, which would have been, I think, very, very good if not for the fact that rook f1, queen g2, rook f2 holds everything together for white, and probably it's just a repetition of moves. Or you can try queen a1, hoping to maybe play rook h1 later, and at first glance it seems like the king on e2 is a sitting duck, and it will be hunted down and mated by the black forces. But I think after bishop takes g5, rook h1, and bishop d2, it's very possible that the king actually survives, because by taking on g5, it's not that important that white takes a pawn, but it is very important that once the checks do begin, you have the f4 square for the king, from which it can go to both g5 and g3. And it will be much, much harder to create an effective mating net around this king now. But in the position after king e2, black could try playing bishop d5, a move which Eric spotted at some point during the live show. I did not see it at all. It's not an easy move to spot, but the point is, after the most obvious move white has, queen f5 check, king b8, the threat of bishop d5 c4 is actually very, very important here. And I think in practical terms, if they reach this position and Sergey found bishop d5, I think it would have created a lot more problems for Magnus to solve than what happened in the game. Sergey, as I already said, played bishop d5, and king g3 objectively may have been even stronger in this position than what Magnus played. But I remember that when we started discussing the move bishop d5 live on the air, my eye was immediately drawn to the move e5, e6, and that was the first move I suggested to Eric, because it just feels correct for white to give this pawn up, to regain control over the h8 square, and make it much, much harder for black to include the rook on g8 in the attack. But yes, it does give up a pawn, so perhaps the very calm king g3 was objectively the stronger choice of the two. But Magnus played e6, I think, very, very fast, and I could perfectly understand why he did that. Queen takes e6, king g3, and in this position, black still looks like he should be slightly better, but he needs to show precision, because now that the h8 square is under white's control, white does have sources of counterplay, and the move Sergey made, although very natural, queen e7, protecting the pawn on g5, creating, hinting at maybe playing rook e8 later, also creating an idea of queen c7 check followed by queen takes a5, which will pick up an important pawn for potential further, later endgames. But the problem with this move is that it allows rook h2. And I'm not entirely sure what move black should make here, but it probably has to be connected with something that keeps the rook on f2, because once this rook gets activated, white will have enough counterplay to feel reasonably safe about his position. Queen e7, rook h2, and perhaps black could try queen c7 check f4, queen takes a5, but after f takes g5, for instance, it does feel like white probably will get out of this alive, because rook h8 as a constant idea will give him enough counterplay here. And after all, it is a position with equal material where, well, the black king on c8 is also not that safe. So we were advocating playing queen c7 and queen takes a5 here, but I don't think that this position objectively is winning for black. it was a better choice than what, well, in terms of prolonging the game, I think it was a better choice than what Sergey played. He played queen f7, f4 takes, queen takes f4, and queen e7 back. And in this position, it seems like black creates a threat of rook f8, but in fact it's not a threat at all, as you will see in a moment. And Magnus played rook h5, bringing the rook up, creating, for instance, an idea of after rook e8, the easiest way for white to make a draw here is to play queen f5 check, king b8, and queen e5 check, using this geometrical motif to exchange everything off. And after rook f8, which looks very strong because after rook f5 you can now play rook e8, and when no queen f5 check is available to white, his position is still, you know, somewhat worrying. But after rook f8, white has rook h7, which makes the draw immediately because, well, black can play queen d8, setting a bit of a trap with rook c7 check, queen takes c7, and white would like to play queen takes f8, but it's not a legal move because of the pin. But after queen d8 you can just play queen e5, rook f3, king h2, and black has no checks, whereas white has very serious threats here, bishop f4 being maybe the main one of them. In view of all that, Sergey took on f4, rook takes e7 and rook e4, and a draw was agreed because this is a very trivially drawn opposite color bishop endgame. This, as I mentioned, is the first game in this match in which Sergey Karjakin had very definite winning chances, and he can also feel confident in that there was a large part of that game which he definitely played better than his opponent. I think the period between if you take this position and then you look at, let's say, this position, it's quite clear that something went quite seriously wrong for white, and that wasn't due to anything horrible Magnus did. It was mainly due to Sergey Karjakin correctly identifying that he has enough time and enough solidity in his position to embark on the king run from g8 to c8, and then he correctly identified that he can play g5 and even push for further expansion with h5. He will, of course, regret not putting Magnus to more of a test once he got to this position. I think that's only natural, but I think there are a lot of positives to take from this game for the challenger. I'm not really prepared to draw any conclusions from what happened in the opening. I think theoretical discussions and all kinds of 1e4 openings are likely to continue, and it's very hard to judge where the both camps are, you know, in their assessment of their chances, and it's not really something I have a set opinion on. But also very importantly, the next two games in this match will both be played with Sergey Karjakin having the white pieces. So after, you can't even say after having survived game 5, because he was actually the side pressing. But with the scores level, Sergey now will have two shots at Magnus's repertoire with black, and it will be very, very interesting to watch what transpires in those games. I will not be commentating on game 6. Eric will be joined by none other than Luki Van Veli for game 6, which should be a very interesting pairing, so you should certainly stick around for that. I will be back for game 7. I hope you've enjoyed our coverage, and this has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.